Let's look at the Sentinel HEMA Longsword from Krieger Armory, USA. Hi folks, Matt Easton here, Schola Gladiatoria. So this is a little bit long time coming, but thanks very much to Krieger Armory in the United States for sending me this fantastic longsword for HEMA practice. It is blunt, it is flexible, it's got a safe tip. We'll talk more about that in a second. This is made of 1095 steel, weighs 1.5 kilograms, slightly over, in fact 1.52, and has a 39-inch blade. So it's a relatively long, real weight sword, I guess. It's a blunt sparring version of a real sword. And the first thing to say about this as well is that it is a sword, a blunt sword, flexible sword. So it has some of the properties of a Federschwert, but it's not a Federschwert. Just grab this Coveton example here. So this is a Feder or Federschwert or Parrotschwert, whatever you want to call it, that people are very familiar with, that has a Hilt on it. This is shiltless, I shiltless you not, and so therefore in some ways it is much more like a real sharp longsword. Now some people would say, oh well, the shilt is there and it's the same width as a real sword blade. Not really. Most of the shilts that survive are broader than most real sharp longswords are. So if you have a sharp longsword, something like an Albion or Arms & Armour, whatever, Denelli, whatever make you've got, and you want something that's an analogue for it, in typical fencing terms, something like this is going to be more similar to your sharp sword because it doesn't have a shilt. It has a gradually tapered blade, so it will handle a little bit more like the real sword because the mass distribution is more like the real sword, and of course it looks more like it as well. And the other big difference is of course that when you receive a blow on the sword, if I'm doing Fury here and someone cuts at me and I put it in a Gioco Largo Incrociata, then the blade can slide all the way down to the crossguard. Whereas of course the shilt of the Federschwert does provide you with a bit more hand protection, and that's one of the primary reasons for them. So be aware if you like the look of one of these swords, because let's all agree they do look a lot nicer, don't they, than a Feder. You will have less hand protection. You are more likely to end up with a broken finger or a broken thumb, depending on what gloves you're wearing with this type of sword. So buyer beware, at your own risk, and all of that kind of stuff. Now, what do I think about this sword? It is lovely. It has some issues that you need to be aware of. And bear in mind, this is relatively expensive. I think it's $495 US. So for a lot of people, that's going to be quite a high-end sword. However, I have to say it does have a fairly high-end finish. First thing you'll notice when I say high-end is the hilt is very nicely made, particularly the grip and the pommel. It's got the look and the quality of, frankly, of a sharp sword. If this had a sharp blade on it, you'd say, yep, it's got a nice hilt. So even though it's a HEMA practice weapon and it's blunt and it's flexible, the fact is that they put a bit more effort into the shape and form of the grip, which is hexagonal, yep, hexagonal with a flared center here, which I have to say I've been using this for drilling purposes, and I have used it for sparring as well. And it is nice for those of you who do a Fury, for example, and we do a lot of techniques where you use the left hand and you're using the sword in one hand. It is nice for the placement of that. I will say though, this is nevertheless a 1.5 kilogram sword with a 39-inch blade. So for use in one hand, this is somewhat unwieldy. At least for me. If you're bigger and stronger than me, then you may have no problems. But it's a little bit unwieldy in one hand. It's not really what I'd call a bastard sword. It is a true longsword and fairly long. If I put the tip on the ground, I'm 6'1". It comes up to about 2 fingers below my sternum. The bottom of my sternum, rib cage. So it is a nicely produced sword, but it is relatively expensive. Be aware of that. Obviously there's a link below to this product. You can check out Krieger Armory's website, look at the other things they make as well. I do also have an arming sword from them, which I'll be reviewing in due course as well, but so far I've only really had the opportunity to use the longsword. So it's very nicely made, 1095 steel. Seems to have very high production and quality control so it's very nicely made. Now in terms of the form of the grip and the pommel, it's pretty long, but it's in proportion to the length of the blade. As I say, it's a 39-inch blade, so it's pretty long, and the hilt doesn't feel overly long for a true longsword at all. Plenty of room there for your gloved hands and that kind of stuff. In terms of the pommel, very nicely formed. It is peened at the end, which you can maybe just about see there, but it's all solid and straight, and there's no vibrations or rattles or anything like that, and this has been used for several sessions. In terms of the crossguard, it's nicely made. It's all, there's no rattles, it's all solid, it hasn't come loose or anything like that. It has got this twist, this artistic twist in the bar, okay, which is done by turning when it's red hot. Now, I have to say I'm personally not a huge fan of those. They're not found on many historical swords. They're occasionally found on historical swords, but it's something that I associate with park railings rather than sword hilts. So personally, I would prefer this hilt if it didn't have that twist in, or it had some other decorative feature. So I'm not a huge fan of those twists, and there are other makers that do those twists as well. I don't personally like them, but that's completely subjective, completely a matter of taste. And if you went to Krieger and said, look, I want one of these, but I want it without this twist, I'm sure they'd do it. I just got the standard Sentinel model. Now, in terms of the blade, there are some things you need to be aware of with the blade. Obviously, it is a longsword shaped blade, so it starts that thick and it tapers in a straight line down to here. Okay, that means that at the hitting end, at the centre of percussion and upwards, it has more mass than a standard Federschwert. So there is no question that this hits with more inertia, because there is more mass at the end of the lever, there's more mass at the hitting end than there is with a standard modern sport Federschwert. So be aware of that. Make sure that your instructors, your training partners, whatever, are happy with you using this, because this will tend on average to hit harder than a standard Federschwert, because the mass, it's got less mass down here, more mass up here. Okay, so the mass is further away from the hand, it has more inertia, it will hit harder as a result. The other thing to be aware of is the tip. Okay, so this is the flared tip, and you'll notice that it flares in that direction, and very slightly it flares in that direction as well. Now, people have different opinions. I personally am a fan of rolled tips. Okay, the reason I like rolled tips is because they produce a large surface area for the minimum amount of extra mass. Okay, so you end up with a big roll up here and a nice square end, but it's hollow because it's rolled. Okay, in my opinion, the problem with flared tips is either you keep them really small and therefore you don't have much surface area, or you make them bigger and then you have a lot of mass right on the tip of the sword where it's often the thinnest, and it's going to be therefore the floppiest. So the problem with a flared tip is when you make it bigger, it makes the blade floppy. When you make it smaller, you don't have much surface area. Now, this is a small one, so this doesn't make the blade floppy, but that is a really, in my opinion, small surface area for thrusting with a sword of this mass, 1.5 kilograms, and it's a long sword. So that means that thrusts coming in from this are really spread over really quite a small area, surface area of tip. Okay, so personally, I am not a fan of that type of tip. If I was using this for regular sparring, I would put a leather strip over the end of that, electrical tape around, I would bulk up the tip slightly. The disadvantage of doing that, it looks crap. Number two, it adds mass to the tip and makes the blade floppy again. Now, talking about blade floppiness, one thing I was slightly surprised about this blade is that there is no notable distal taper. Okay, the blade is roughly 4 millimeters thick here. I haven't actually measured it, but eyeballing it, it seems to be about that. Maybe 4 or 5 millimeters here, and it stays the same thickness all the way down. Now, because this is a tapered blade, tapered in silhouette blade, that does mean that the flex predominantly still happens in the end of the blade. So in terms of the flex, there's no real problem. It doesn't bend very much in the base of the blade because the blade is wider here than it is down here. So they can sort of get away with having no distal taper because the blade is broader and tapers down. Now, I have to also say, this is true of some real medieval and Renaissance historical sharp, real genuine swords. Okay, not all period swords have distal taper, and some of them have only very slight distal taper. However, some of them have a lot of distal taper. So it is something that's notable. Now, I have to also say, and compare like with like and be fair, if I take this Coveton Feder, it does have a little bit of distal taper, but not very much. So it's about 5 millimeters here, and it goes down to about maybe 3.5, 4 millimeters here. So it is a little bit thinner. So yes, it tapers a tiny bit down this way, and it tapers a bit this way as well. So it does taper in both planes, and it does have distal taper, but it's minimal. And I have to say, there are feathers, other feathers out there, which don't really have distal taper. So you can sometimes get away with having a blade that's got taper in this direction and therefore doesn't need taper in this direction. Is that true of this sword? That one troubles me slightly. Now, apart from the tip, one of the other things I'm not really a fan of with this sword is that it is quite wobbly. Now, part of the reason for that is it has no distal taper and is not especially thick here. I personally think they should have started with slightly thicker bar stock and had it slightly distal tapered. But the second factor which exacerbates the wobble problem is the fact that this is a long grip with a pommel at the end, okay, which gives essentially a sort of resonance, a pendulum-like effect. So if I hold this in one hand and hit it with the pommel, you will notice there is a lot of blade wiggle, okay? Like a lot. If I do the same thing with the Coveton feather here, it's much stiffer, okay? You got wobble, but it doesn't wobble as much, and it doesn't wobble as much in the hand, and it returns to still much more quickly. The Krieger Armory here, when I do this, it stays wobbling for quite a long time, and it wobbles to a larger degree. So the blade is a little bit wobbly. However, now that's very noticeable in one hand because the pommel is able to oscillate when I do this. When I hold this in two hands, it actually becomes quite a lot stiffer. So I have to say, when I first opened this up and did dry handling of it and just, you know, generally swinging it around, it felt like it had the potential to be a very floppy or wobbly blade. I have to say, in use, both in drilling and in sparring, I actually haven't really found that to be the case, okay? So I think it is a little bit on the floppy side, but once you've got two hands on it, this gets mitigated, okay? So yes, I think it could be better, but I don't think it's bad at all. Now, another aesthetic detail to throw in is this has got a very attractive triple fillet system in here that you'll see. As an aficionado of original antiques, I have to say one thing I personally am not that keen. I do like the triple fillet. I think it looks fantastic. But one thing I don't like about it, if I'm being really nitpicky, is you'll notice that these fillets are the same width rather at the base of the blade as they are down here where they finish. Same one with each of those either side. They are literally straight parallel channels. Now, not to say you don't find some antiques like that, you do, but the difference is this has been ground in with either a CNC machine or a wheel, I should think. And in reality, or rather originally, these were often forged in to begin with and then finished by hand with a file. So often these fillers, what they actually do is they taper as they go down, and that looks better. The reason it looks better is because this is a tapered blade. So here, the distance between the fillet and the side is that thick, and down here it should maintain that thickness. So what should happen is the fillers should come down almost like a tapering triangle, so that the edge stays equidistant away from them. Instead, the filler gets closer and closer and closer to the edge, and in fact, as you'll see here, it's a kind of triangle. If that filler continued up here, it would eventually go out of the edge, which visually to me just looks a little bit off. I actually think that Krieger could get over that by shortening these side fillers. So the central filler, it's aesthetically and visually doesn't really make a problem, but the outer ones I feel just come a little bit too close to the edge there. So if they finished a little bit further down, maybe about 3 inches down, I think they would visually look better. But that is super nitpicky, and it makes no difference whatsoever to the actual, you know, handling or quality or end result of, you know, using it or anything like that. In terms of durability, I haven't used this a huge amount yet, but it has taken basically no marks. I mean, you can see it's where it's been clashing against other swords. You can see sort of a glinting on the surface, but I can run my hand up and down here. This is 1095 steel and seems to be really well heat treated, and absolutely you can bend it to a large degree and it returns absolutely true. You know, there's no issues like that, and the flex is very even, very steady. It doesn't have any sudden jerks to it, so you know, the heat treatment and the tapering's been done well. So to summarize, I would say that this is a fantastic quality sword. And I wouldn't hesitate at all to recommend Krieger Armory's quality control, the steel and heat treatment they're using, the finish, the fit and finish is all absolutely fantastic. Their quality of manufacturing is clearly exceptionally high, no question there whatsoever, and worth the money. Speaking personally about the design, and your mileage might vary on this, but speaking personally about the design, there are some things that I would change. I do like the fact that this is a shiltless longsword, it's what I asked for. They also do fetish verts if that's what you want, so have a look at those. But if what you want is a shiltless longsword, be aware of the drawbacks of them. But I really think primarily this weapon could be improved in a couple of ways. The minor point about the fullers I just mentioned, but for me personally the two main issues are the wobbliness, which I think comes partially from the complete lack of distal taper and or not enough taper in this plane. So I think if it was maybe slightly wider at the base, or I don't know, there's various ways of getting around that. But at the moment the blade seems a little bit too thin and flat here, and then having no taper at all just makes it flex too near the middle of the sword, in my opinion. And then finally there's that tip. I think if you're going to have a flared tip, for safety reasons, you have to make it a bigger flared tip. The problem in this specific case is that would increase the wobble issue, which maybe is why they've gone for quite a small flared tip. But for me, that tip is problematic. And I would also say, just on the tip issue, the other thing is striking. When you hit someone with the tip of the blade, it means it focuses a lot of force into that little corner there. So I'm not really a fan of this tip, but I know that there's people out there who loved flared tips, say that they have no problem with flared tips and hate roll tips. So as I say, your mileage might vary. So yeah, so to finish off, fantastic quality sword, seemed like an awesome company to deal with, really nice communication, fantastic people, fantastic production quality. There was some issues with shipping because we used FedEx. Never use FedEx for swords coming to the UK. Just use anyone except for FedEx, UPS, DHL, anything's fine, even just normal postal service, don't use FedEx. But they were fantastic through that whole rigmarole, so fantastic company, fantastic quality. I do not hesitate to recommend them at all. I'm really looking forward to seeing more stuff from them. There will be another review coming out of me. Probably I'll do another one of this after it's been through some more use as well. But there'll be the arming sword review for this as well. But check out the link below to Krieger Armory. They're making really, really lovely stuff in the United States. So if you are in the USA, you can buy from them and you won't have to pay import taxes, of course. And you'll pay a lot less for shipping. So there's that to think of. I'm very much looking forward to seeing what these guys do next, because they are really nicely made. And oh, and the grip, I love the grip. This is the nicest grip of any practice longsword or fetish vert or anything else that I've had in recent times. The grip is freaking awesome and would be good enough on a medium to high quality sharp sword. It's really, really nice grip, really nicely wrapped, really nice friction, just really nicely shaped and everything. Okay, so bags of quality there. Check out the link below, and thanks again to Krieger Armory for sending me this to review.